There's a certain kind of silence that only comes after you've spent 20 years under the hood of a car. It's a heavy, metallic sort of quiet where you can practically hear the rust forming, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the silence of a woman who's just realized her entire world is made of wet cardboard. My name's Elias Thorne, just a guy who likes his torque wrenches and his peace and quiet, living in a house my granddad built back when this part of the county was nothing but dirt roads and dreams, long before the suburbs crawled out here and started putting up white picket fences like they were building a fortress. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those mornings where the humidity sticks to your skin like a bad memory, and I was just wiping the grease off my hands when I saw her, Cynthia Vane, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, marching down my gravel driveway like she was leading a cavalry charge. She wasn't in oppos to even walking on the pavement. She was stomping, and in her hand was this thick manila envelope that looked like it contained the secrets to the universe, or at least a very expensive headache. End quote. Elias Thorne, you are in flagrant violation of the Willow Creek Covenants, Article 4, Section 12, regarding the operation of a commercial enterprise in a primary residential zone. End quote. She snapped, her voice sounding like a rusted gate swinging in the wind, and before I could even get a word in, she shoved that envelope against my chest. I just stood there, blinking, looking at this woman who was dressed in a pastel track suit that probably cost more than my first truck. Her eyes narrowed into these tiny slits of pure, unadulterated malice. End quote. Cynthia, for the love of all that is holy. End quote. I told her, trying to keep my voice steady because I've learned that getting loud just gives people like her oxygen. End quote. I don't live in Willow Creek. My mailbox is on a county route, and my property line ends exactly 30 feet before your fancy stone entrance. End quote. But she didn't in oppos. T care about facts, she care about optics. Jabbing a finger toward my matte black service van parked near the garage, claiming that it's, end quote, industrial, aesthetic, end quote, was hemorrhaging their property values every single day it remained visible to her residents. She told me she was suing me for every dime I had for the, end quote, nuisance, end quote, of my existence. And as she turned on her heel to march back to her kingdom, I realized I wasn't in oppos. T just dealing with a neighbor, I was dealing with a predator who had run out of prey in her own borders. I spent the next 3 nights sitting at my kitchen table, the yellow light of the overhead lamp reflecting off the, end quote, summons to appear, end quote, while I dug through crates of old property deeds and county charters. Because if there's one thing a mechanic knows, it's that if a machine is making a noise it shouldn't, there's always a loose bolt somewhere. I called up an old friend, a retired surveyor named Miller who'd seen every land grab in this state since the 70s, and we spent hours looking at these grainy, digitized maps from the county clerk's office until he suddenly stopped, tapped the screen with a weathered finger, and started laughing so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. End quote, Elias, end quote, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and glee, end quote. This woman ISN in oppos, T just barking up the wrong tree. She in oppos, S standing in an entirely different forest. Look at the filing dates on the Willow Creek Incorporation papers. End quote. It turned out that 15 years ago, when the developers were rushing to get those McMansions built, they'd botched the final certification with the state zoning board. A tiny clerical error, a missing signature, and a failure to refile after a boundary dispute, meaning the Willow Creek HOA didn't end oppos. T legally exist as a governing entity. It was a private club masquerading as a government, a paper empire built on nothing but bluff and intimidation, and Cynthia Vane had been the empress of a ghost ship for over a decade. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom felt small and stuffy, smelling of old paper and desperation, and there sat Cynthia with a lawyer who looked like he'd been bought on clearance at a suburban mall, both of them smugger than a pair of cats in a creamery. She spent 15 minutes regaling the judge with tales of my, quote, greasy eyesore, quote, of a business, showing blurry photos she'd taken while trespassing on my grass, talking about community standards and the sanctity of the Willow Creek, quote, lifestyle, quote. When the judge finally looked at me and asked if I had anything to say, I didn't in oppos. To give a speech, I didn't in oppos. TL, I just walked up to the bench and handed him a certified packet from the Secretary of State's office. End quote. Your Honor, end quote, I said, and the silence in the room started to get heavy, end quote. I'm not here to argue about my van or my lawn. I'm here to point out that the plaintiff has no legal standing to bring this suit, or any suit, because Willow Creek Estates is not a registered corporation in this county, end quote. The judge's eyebrows went up so high they almost hit his hairline, and as he started flipping through the documents, the color began to drain from Cynthia's face. Not all at once, but in patches until she looked like a piece of old, molded cheese. He asked for a recess to verify the filings, and for the next hour, I sat on that hard wooden bench while Cynthia whispered furiously to her lawyer, who looked like he wanted to climb out the nearest window. When the judge came back, his face was like flint, and he looked directly at Cynthia and told her that not only was my case dismissed with prejudice, but that her entire organization was currently operating in violation of state law. He didn't oppose. T just stopped there. He ordered an immediate freeze on their accounts pending a full forensic audit by the county prosecutor because if they weren't in oppose, T, a legal HOA, then every, end quote, fine, end quote, they'd collected for 15 years was technically an act of extortion. Walking out of that courthouse, I thought it was over. I thought I'd just go back to my engines and my quiet life, but the universe has a funny way of pushing you back into the fire when you've got a taste for it. A few weeks later, the neighborhood was in a state of absolute anarchy. People were painting their front doors purple, tearing up their lawns to plant corn, and generally celebrating the death of the tyrant. But then the letters started arriving again. Only this time, they weren't in oppos, T from Willow Creek. They were from something called the, end quote, Covenant Heritage Trust, end quote, and they were demanding, end quote, restitution, end quote, for past due balances signed by a man named Julian Vane, Cynthia's brother. It was a classic pivot, a fresh coat of paint on a rotten fence, try to trick the elderly folks who were too scared to realize the dragon was dead. I found myself standing in Mrs. Gable's living room, a woman who'd taught kindergarten to half the town, watching her hands shake as she held a letter telling her she owed $5,000 or they'd put a lien on her house. That was the moment it stopped being about me and my van and started being about the fact that some people think power is something you could just inherit or steal if you're loud enough. I went back to Miller, back to the maps, and we didn't in oppos. T, just look at boundaries this time. We looked at the money, following the trail of those, end quote, fines, end quote, through a maze of shell companies that Julian had set up to wash the cash Cynthia was squeezing out of the neighbors. We found the receipts for the European cruises, the luxury cars, and the, end quote, consulting fees, end quote, that went straight into Julian's offshore accounts, all while the community pool was turning green and the streetlights were flickering out. I took everything, the maps, the bank records Miller helped me scrape together, and the footage from the hidden cameras I'd installed around my property that showed Julian and Cynthia meeting in the dead of night to swap ledgers. And I walked it straight into the FBI field office 2 towns over. It took months, and there were times I thought they'd just let it slide, but then came the morning of the raid. And let me tell you, there is no sound more satisfying than a battering ram hitting a door that was bought with stolen money. Cynthia and Julian were led out in handcuffs, their, end quote, heritage, end quote, crumbling around them while the neighbors stood on their porches and watched in a silence that was finally, truly peaceful. Now, I spend my evenings sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the county road, and every now and then, someone from the old Willow Creek area drives by and honks, or drops off a 6-pack of beer as a thank you. The HOA is gone, the, end quote, trust, end quote, is a memory, and I'm actually thinking about running for a seat on the town council. Not because I want to tell people what to do, but because I want to make sure nobody ever feels like a guest in their own home again. It's funny how a mechanic with a wrench and a grudge can do more for justice than a whole room full of lawyers. But I guess when you know how things are supposed to fit together, you can tell pretty quickly when someone's trying to strip the gears. But hey, that's just my story. It makes me wonder, though, how many of you out there are living under the thumb of some, end quote, emperor, end quote, who doesn't in oppos to even have a permit to be on the throne? Have you ever had to fight for your own dirt? Or are you just waiting for someone like me to show up with a map and a camera? Drop a comment below and tell me if you think I went too far, or if you think every neighborhood needs a guy like me to keep the queens and kings in check. I'll be here under the hood, waiting to hear what you got to say.